So, Alexander, let's talk about Hungary and Ukraine and Russia and energy. We have the Ukrainian ambassador in Hungary has been summoned to speak with Hungarian officials because they feel that Ukraine is interfering in the internal affairs of Hungary because Hungary has inked a gas deal, an energy deal with Russia. And make a long story short, well, this kind of really sucks for Ukraine gas transit, doesn't it? But we've been saying this for a long, long time, that Nord Stream 2 and all the moves that are being made, not only by Russia, but by Germany, and it's important to stress that Germany was the one that came up with this whole Nord Stream 2 idea. All of these moves and all of this Nord Stream 2 stuff was going to eventually destroy the business of gas transit via Ukraine. And here we have Hungary, being one of the first countries to say, you know what, this makes more sense for us for a business perspective. Ukraine's not happy about it, and Hungary's not happy about the fact that Ukraine is meddling with this decision from Hungary. So get into this story. It's a fascinating story.
It's a fascinating story. Now, in part one, the program we did, of which this is to some extent a sequel, we talked about Macron, and we talked about how Macron's all his talk about European defence is ultimately hot air and doesn't really mean anything, and it's just a pose which is empty. Contrast that with what Hungary has just done, and Hungary's just taken a number of important moves, and it's a small country. Remember, it's not a country with the power of France or the geopolitical weight that France has, but Hungary has looked at the situation, and it's first of all taken steps to secure its energy supplies, energy security being a hot topic issue in Europe at the moment. So they've done the deal with Gazprom. They will get the gas. It won't come through Ukraine. As I understand it, some will come through Austria, which presumably means Turk Stream, but it might be Nord Stream. I don't know. But anyway, they've come directly to this deal with Gazprom. And why shouldn't they? After all, it's their country, their energy needs. They need to guarantee their energy needs. Why must they guarantee Ukraine's? What does Hungary owe Ukraine that obliges Hungary to take steps to protect Ukraine's position as a transit state? So the Hungarians act to protect their interests, and the Ukrainians accuse them and all kinds of things. They try and run a campaign against Hungary in the international media and within Hungary itself, where, of course, there's elections coming. So what do the Hungarians do? They call in the Ukrainian ambassador and they give him a major ticking off. And they do something else. They've also made an announcement just a few days ago, which is to say that there is no way that Ukraine can enter NATO because it's clearly not ready to enter NATO anytime soon. Now, these are steps of substance. That's the difference between a country that's led by a real leader, which is Viktor Orban, who actually makes moves to protect his country's energy security, its domestic position, and its international position, and contrast that with Macron coming up with empty comments about European armies, which are never going to see the light of day. So that's the difference. That's the difference between Hungary, which pursues an independent line, and France, which talks big but ultimately doesn't.
Well said. Hungary has to make the best decision for its own security and make the best deal to secure its energy. Comment on this statement that I'm going to make right now, Alexander. What a terrible position Ukraine has put itself into. What a terrible geopolitical position, security position, energy position Ukraine put itself into under the leadership and tutelage of Joe Biden.
Well, absolutely. Yes, that's entirely right, because, of course, it's always important to remember that at the time of the events in 2014, which led to the present political system in Ukraine being established and which set Ukraine on its Euro-Atlantic course, as it's called, who was the person who was in charge of things in Ukraine? Who was this person who was being sent by Washington to chair meetings of the Ukrainian cabinet and who was in effect telling the Ukrainians what they would do, down to sacking their own attorney generals? We know that story, and we don't need to go into more about it. It was none other than Joe Biden. I mean, he was, to all intents and purposes, the viceroy, America's viceroy in Ukraine, and that was the reality of it. Now, he led Ukraine along this path, but Ukraine has also, or at least some people in Ukraine, have willingly followed it. And this is a point which I think we need to remember. I mean, countries like Germany, like Hungary, are now taking steps to ensure their energy security by bypassing Ukraine. And the energy crisis in Europe, which we're going to discuss in another programme, that partly shows why it is important for countries to secure their energy position. And that means effectively doing deals with a big gas supplier, which is Gazprom. So that's what countries like Germany, Hungary are doing. And what does Ukraine do? It sulks. It gets itself into an enormous tantrum, and it acts as if it has some kind of a right to be a transit state. Now, why does Ukraine have a right to be a transit state? Why does Ukraine feel that it has a right to have the Russians pay it $3 billion a year for for permission to send gas through Ukraine? What kind of a commercial arrangement is this, where somebody is obliged to subsidize a particular country? I mean, it is an absurd thing, but it is the absurd position that the Ukrainians have boxed themselves into thinking that they're entitled to. They act as if they have a right to be a transit country. They get enormously angry and talk about betrayal when countries like Hungary and Germany actually do their own deals with the Russians, as they are perfectly entitled to do. And in the meantime, relying upon all those assurances that, Joe gave when he was there, come on man and all that, they've now found themselves in a position where their industries are rotting away, their agriculture is in a mess, their finances depend on the IMF, they've become either the second poorest or the poorest country in Europe, and they are in an absolute hole which they're not getting out of. Rather than constantly calling out other people and blaming other people for betrayal, what they need to do is to take a step back and think about the situation they're in and look at the map, look at the country with which they need, for obvious commercial and business reasons, to maintain a good relationship with, at least a good business relationship with, and work out some kind of arrangement with that country. That country is, of course, Russia. Denying that reality has led Ukraine into a dead end.
Yeah, I want you to expand on that a little bit, Alexander. Does Ukraine have the power? Definitely not now, but maybe in the near term. And it better come up with a solution in the near term because the country is in a hole, like you said. But does it have the capacity to tell the United States, principally the United States, and secondly, Europe, bugger off, leave us alone? Yes, we want good relations with you, Europe, absolutely. But we need to figure things out with our neighbor, Russia, because at the end of the day, that is where our business interests lie. That is where our prosperity lies and our future lies. And I say that because, you made a statement. You said, why should they feel like they have the right to be a transit nation? I completely agree with that. They would have had that right or that privilege if they had excellent diplomatic and strategic relations with Russia. Then you can make the argument and say Russia sees them as a preferential partner. and a strategic partner. So they will have this gas transit in Ukraine, and they will see it as a strategic interest in order to subsidize Ukraine because they have these brotherly relations. But they blew that apart. And so now they've lost that privilege and that right. And we can't forget that when you talked about betrayal, you mentioned the word betrayal. It wasn't Russia that betrayed them; it was Germany.
Yeah,
Germany egged them on. They egged on Ukraine to start up stuff in the east and to start up stuff with Russia. And then what did Germany do as they were egging Ukraine on? They made a deal for Gazprom behind their back, for Nord Stream 2 behind their back. So just expand that. What can Ukraine do this? Can they turn the ship?
absolutely they can. I mean, all that it needs is political will. Ukraine can turn the ship round. I mean, what they can do, it would not be particularly difficult. Firstly, they could tell Christine Lagarde and the IMF to take a running jump and leave Ukraine alone, because, frankly, the advice they've been getting and the help they've been getting from the IMF has been a disaster. So they can do that, and they can start talking to the Russians, and they can do a deal with eastern Ukraine. There's a roadmap to do it. It was agreed in Minsk all the way back in 2015, and they can do that, and they can reestablish those links. And there is no objective reason why the Russians, in that case, would not want to work and deal with Ukraine. And I'm sure they would. I mean, they would want peace on their eastern border, on their western border, the Russians' western border. And of course, that might involve agreeing the continuation of gas transit through Ukraine. Now, there are problems with that. I mean, those pipelines are, by all accounts, steadily deteriorating anyway. The Russians have in the past, this is, I'm talking about discussions that took place 10, 15 years ago. What they wanted was to have some kind of joint control over those pipelines with Ukraine, partly in order to keep them in a good state of repair. And Ukraine wouldn't even agree to that. So maybe there'd have to be some, major refurbishment exercise done. But, why would Russia objectively prefer pipelines through Turkey, for example, rather than pipelines through Ukraine, a country that many Russians still think of as a brotherly country? It would be possible to do. They could do it. They could quickly see their economy recover, because all the immense synergies that exist would quickly come into place. But of course, they're not doing it for the moment. Not because the economics don't make sense. They manifestly do. Not because the Russians aren't, willing to go along that path, but because, of course, the politics in Ukraine make that all but impossible. We have a very weak president in Zelensky. We have very, very militant nationalist groups that are viscerally and fervently anti-Russian. We have all kinds of oligarchs who are terrified of Ukraine falling under Russian control, as they would see it, which might put their own positions in Ukraine in jeopardy. And of course, we have the United States, the neocons, and all those sort of people playing their chess games. And we have the European Commission, the Brussels bureaucrats, who are obsessed with expanding Europe wherever they possibly can, except, of course, to include Russia. So we have all of this coalition of forces which is driving Ukraine ever deeper down an endless hole until eventually it drops into a kind of economic abyss. So I don't really see this policy changing for the moment, unless and until there's a major breakdown. I mean, what we've seen, in fact, over the last year is that when a party did emerge in Ukraine, which for a period was leading the opinion polls, and which did seek a rapprochement with Russia, and which was a popular move, what you saw is the entire Ukrainian establishment unite to basically break it. So we've seen its radio and TV stations and newspapers and websites all closed down. We've seen its leaders arrested or sanctioned. We've seen all those sort of steps taken. And of course, the West has had absolutely nothing to say. They talk about Viktor Orban's authoritarian policies. But when it comes to Ukraine, things like that happen, and the West says nothing at all.
Yeah. All right. We'll leave it there. Just to everyone watching in the U.S. and in the West, if you want to see what it's like when Biden ruins a country, well, then look at the job he did with Ukraine.
Oh yeah.
And there you get a glimpse, Alexander, as to what it means to be ruled by Joe Biden and the results of a Joe Biden presidency. You have an example in Ukraine.
Well,
right there.
absolutely. And let's also say that that was Joe when he was a little bit more together. I mean, Joe less together. Well, maybe if you want to see the future of the Republic, just look at what's happening in Kiev and Ukraine, and it might come even faster than you think.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, everybody, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code RealNews, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and Super U. You'll find all our videos there. Take care.